Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming on to Insight today. Today, I have a very wonderful guest who's agreed to tune in with us all the way from South Africa. Welcome, Matuba.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you for having me.
There, Matuba. So my audience gets a sense of who you are and what you've done. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce you a little bit, but then we're going to get to know more about the work that you've done in the past. You, according to your LinkedIn profile, you're a journalist, you're a reporter, you're an advocate, you're a human rights activist. And on top of that, you work with LGBTQ concerns. All of these blended together, it's got to be a fascinating story. I'm sure this work is not easy given today's current circumstances, regardless of where you're at in the globe. So first of all, thank you for that work that you are doing. It is so meaningful. It goes a long way, even if you don't see the fruit of your labor in that moment. It's good work. And I wanted to also open this up so that way we can get to know the person, get to know the man behind all these distinguished accomplishments, shall we?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's quite strange to hear when somebody talks about me like that, but I really appreciate that.
Oh gosh. So I always like to start these interviews from the beginning because let's be honest, it all starts when we're young, doesn't it? And that's when we're really learning more about the world, we're learning about ourselves, and that's when we start tuning in. Oh, I'm different. And it just compounds as you get older. So walk me through what it was like for a young Matuba growing up. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were born and raised in South Africa, yes?
Yes. So I come from a township in the very north of South Africa's capital, Pretoria. It's called Soshanguve. That's where I was born. And incidentally, I still live there. I'm one of those people whose life improved so much, from being from a working class family that moved into middle class. I just made my life better in a township where a lot of young Black people are unable to escape poverty and drug addiction, HIV/AIDS, and all those kind of things. And I've been able to do that for myself and with the support of my family. So I really embrace where I come from up to this day. I'm 40 years old, by the way. I was born in 1983 in Soshanguve, and I come from a very Christian family, but very Lutheran. And I express Lutheran because it's a Protestant church that inform the politics that we follow at home. And my parents, my father especially, was an anti-apartheid activist. So we grew up in a home that was very politically conscious, and it was a blessing in disguise for me growing up a queer child. My parents did not have the language to say this is a queer child, but they saw that I was not a mainstream little boy. I was raised with so much care and love, and they nurtured every passion that I had. And so I was an affirmed child in a space where not a lot of queer people can give the same testimony as I'm giving now. And we've always known that education was your key to success, because my parents always told us how much they had no money to leave us when they're gone. So education would be our ticket out of the strife that most South Africans were dealing with. So I grew up a very fairly politically conscious person, and I went into activism. And very early, I think when I attended my first Pride, I was 18 years old. I was just starting university, and I was just starting to meet new people who were queer, because I never really had friends who were openly queer, and I knew very little about being queer. So I think my activism started at that time, and by the time I finished my journalism diploma, I decided I'm going to use my journalism to advocate for minorities in society, because I could not see myself when I watched the news. I could not see myself when I read the newspaper. And so that's what I did with my craft as a journalist, always advocating for people with whose voices aren't really heard all the time. So I chose to amplify voices of minorities, which is LGBTQ people, women, children, people with disabilities, migrants, because we have a lot of those in South Africa. So, and I think that pretty much the foundation of the person that I am up until today, when I evolved from being a journalist into a human rights advocate.
Let's go back to, because you mentioned how you had this upbringing. Your parents were activists, anti-apartheid activists, no less. That's something to be very proud of. People look on that and they can say, "Wow, you did that," or someone in your family did that. That's amazing. I'm sure it wasn't popular back in those days, though.
No, I mean, my dad was arrested for over a year without trial, and for 8 months of that time, my mother did not know where my father was. In fact, there was a time when my mom was told that my dad had died in prison, and she started looking for his remains for months until she found out that he was in fact alive. So it is certainly something to be proud of, but I admire my dad for, when he came back from that incarceration, we were working towards, a new dispensation in South Africa. And there are many internal politics within the anti-apartheid movement that, we don't talk about, that he also wasn't comfortable talking about, because I always asked him why he left politics after that. But there were very socio-political differences within the movement at that time. And he chose, in his late 40s, early 50s, to go to finish his law degree and have a job that's going to get him out of poverty and work for his family. And that's what he did. And he remains a role model for me. He was always a role model for me. And I always, because he was a baby boomer. He was born in 1945. And you don't get a lot of people from South Africa, who would understand, an LGBTQ child and nurture that and protect that up until I got married. I mean, my father helped me pay for my when I got married to my late husband, and those are not testimonies of many African children, because many of my friends, many of my fellow activists, have not been seeing their families in a long time, because they could not reconcile their gender identity, their sexuality, sexual orientation. So I'm very blessed and fortunate to be where I am today.
Yes, and kudos to the family. They were able to love and support you. And even if they didn't have the language, I keep telling people all the time, everything else comes with time. But starting from a place of love is always the best step in any situation that you're in. So kudos to them. That in itself is a form of a radical thought and expression, and it's so beautiful. I love it. So let's take this over to, because you mentioned before that you were starting to get interested in not just the politics, but in reporting around when you were growing up as well. And at least from what I'm understanding from what you've told me, one of the things I'm now curious about is, was there a particular moment where you said to yourself, I'm going to become a journalist, or was it a gradual process for you?
I think, in fact, my brother saved me from going to medical school, because I loved writing. My mom worked in a bookstore, so I read a lot of books from a young age, and I started being fluent in English at a much younger age than a regular person who comes from Soshanguve like me. So, and I got feedback from people telling me that, I write very well, I'm a good writer, but I don't think I embraced it enough. It was just something I did to journal, mostly because there were things, I had thoughts that I could not share with people because I could not understand what was happening within myself. So I used writing, and my brother would pick up my writing and would read, and he thought I was a great writer. And later on, when I finished high school, and I wanted to study radiology, actually, that's what I wanted to study. And he was like, "Are you crazy? You should be doing something that, because you're better, right? A better writer." And so journalism was my second choice, and I got in journalism school. And I was sort of wary of it because I really wanted to live my life away from the spotlight, because I thought if I'm a radiologist, I wouldn't have to explain myself to people. But now that I'm here in journalism, and it's such a heteronormative environment, and I feel so stifled. I feel like I cannot talk, I cannot express myself. And every time I spoke, people would look at me, people would wonder, people would whisper. And that kind of made me feel uncomfortable until a point when I decided that, you know what, maybe this is my destiny and I need to embrace it. And I was never really in the closet, but I think my journalism school days were my coming out days officially, because I even changed the way I dressed, and I changed the company I keep, because I kept on keeping the company of heterosexual men who always wanted to affirm each other with so much toxicity, and I didn't relate to any of that. And I changed all of that about myself, and I started attending more political meetings and book clubs and so forth, and with more open-minded people. So I think journalism and passion for it came right at the end of my studies, to be honest with you.
I love it. So this is a beautiful process of you finding, and that's so important to have that support network. It really goes a long way. I loved how you mentioned it was your brother who basically told you, "Hey, you're a writer. Why not use your writing to make a living? That sounds more up your alley." We need people in our lives like that, because we did not come into this world alone. We were not meant to live this life alone. I'm not saying you can't ignore bad advice, but when it's good advice, that's why we have people, so they can give us the good advice when we need it. Wow.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned when you were going into your career that you felt like the odd one out from the beginning. People would whisper about you behind your back, and you were in a very heteronormative kind of environment. What was the challenges that you were facing? Because I mean, anyone can talk about anyone else, and that's more of a reflection of them than it is of you. So let's walk through some of the obstacles you've had in your career, especially when you first started.
Yeah, I mean, the whispers behind my back were trauma I had endured from, school, and I often had to have my dad come to school to intervene on my behalf, because I was a little effeminate boy. When in the school choir, I was in the same line as the girls because my voice hadn't broken. I've got a good singing voice, so I sang soprano, and the teachers I was a little bit of a teacher's pet myself also, so that didn't help my cause.
Oh gosh, easy scapegoat right there. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I think in the newsroom, I remember my first internship. I didn't last because I could feel that I was Black, I was queer in a predominantly white space in South Africa. And something my dad always told me was, people will always mistreat you based on your race, and sometimes your sexual orientation, but you must always know that you are morally superior to them, and don't stay in spaces that don't embrace you or make you reach your full potential. And I left quickly, and it was one of the prestigious places to work at that time in South Africa. But I left and I went to something else where it was less, harmful for my well-being. And even in that less harmful environment, you still found yourself, not being seen, or not even seeing yourself in the content that you create. And I think that's what informed my decision to push back against, sometimes the editorial decisions that just make me uncomfortable. And South Africa was going through a political, a landscape that was changing, a political landscape that was changing all the time, where we had a constitution that's very progressive, that recognizes me, who I am, and who I love, and it protected all of those things. But in a space of work, I didn't feel protected. So I started pushing boundaries. I started wanting to tell much more interesting stories about people's lived experiences. And I think that's what sort of set me apart from all other journalists. And I can't say I'm an award-winning journalist at the moment, because I produce content that was never really palatable for mainstream media. But I rose through the ranks very quickly in my career. I became an editor while I was quite young. And that's where I think I had the most power, because I could control the narrative more of the space where I worked, and I made people I sensitized, journalists on how they can say things, how they can't say certain things, and even simple things like showing Black women crying on screen. I'm a TV journalist, so I made a rule in the newsroom that I don't want to see a grieving Black woman on screen if it's not necessary. You know what I mean? Because sometimes we often see just Black people sad, poor, unhappy on mainstream television, and we needed to change those kind of things. And then we started having even more queer people on air, because it was never really done. And we started having more stories about queerness and being queer, and showing our diversity, because I come from a very diverse country. So I think I used my craft to sort of boost the narrative and show that how diverse we are. And I mean, a lot of journalists that I worked with today who I mentored are award-winning journalists. Some of them are editors today, and they're still continuing the work and making our country the best as it can be against all these, pushbacks that we see from evangelism that is now being shipped into Africa, and populism that we see that is within South Africa. There's xenophobia that we see that's within South Africa. But I know our newsrooms are filled with people who are very thoughtful and politically conscious, and they understand their job and their duty to South Africa and the Constitution.
I want to go back to what you said too, because you mentioned before how by being in the space where you had decisions, you were able to affect the way that stories were being told. That is not a small accomplishment. When you are able to have decisions and you can talk to people about, hey, this is the reason why you shouldn't just show grief of Black women for the heck of it. You have to make sure there is a purpose behind it. It's about making sure that these people who have been on the sidelines of our stories and have been vilified in our media, something that we didn't even used to do until we were occupied by other forces. That is essential as well. I love this, because essentially what you're talking about is making sure that the stories, and you're in a field where there's so much meaning that is made, and you can literally change the tide of how an election goes. You can change the tide of how a jury rules, all of these things.
Yeah.
What was the what was the moment where you realized, wow, I am actually making a difference in my field as this reporter, as this human rights conscious activist?
I couldn't have done it on my own, to be honest with you. I just happened to be working in a newsroom that was fairly young, and people were open to ideas. And I think I took advantage of that. That, these are fairly young people and middle-aged, straight men who came to work at a media that was independent as well. And so those kind of factors really boosted my mission to try and open up conversations about topics that are usually not spoken about in mainstream media. And I think I used it well to my advantage, because I've always been an activist, and I was never, and we always had this argument, healthy arguments in the newsroom about, whether as a journalist can you be an activist or you remain objective. And I refused to remain objective when it was clear who the victim was, and I refused to be objective when I knew the truth. So it was, it was always a back and forth. Sometimes I lost the newsroom battles, but most of the time I really did win, because I see how South Africa now, the independent media behaves. It's either very extreme or it's either very woke, and acknowledging the changing world that we live in and making everybody feel seen, because that is important. When somebody doesn't, because I remember not being able to see myself in the content that I used to produce, and I never wanted that to happen to anybody, any other queer person or somebody who's blind, somebody who lives with any kind of disability, not be able to relate to the kind of content, because we are supposed to be the one that informs everybody. We are supposed to be the people that help people make informed decisions about their lives and make them aware of what's happening to them. So
yes, one of the things that I keep coming back to in my thoughts when I'm hearing your story is the sense of you are able to really change the tide of so much rhetoric just by being fulfilling your space in that role. And one of the things I keep wondering about too is how, news is not easy. As someone who studied media, as someone who works in media, who is building a podcast now as we speak, this is not easy work. There's a lot of demands. There's deadlines that have to be met, expectations that have to be fulfilled. And then on top of that, trying to be human conscious of it in all of this, when a lot of people are pushing back and saying you're not being objective. It completely does challenge the notion of what objectivity is. For the longest time, objectivity has always been from the perspective of one particular group of people, that their truth, it has to be the foundation of objectivity, and everyone else's is subjective. But the work you're doing, from the sounds of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you're doing, is pushing back on this idea that there is only one way of looking at objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, the pushbacks had to be constant, and I mean, and you have to create an environment where people can be outspoken about their ideas, and sometimes our decision also to become a radicalized newsroom that we were was because we were so conscious of the history of that country, where we knew how many people were disenfranchised because they never had a voice. So sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean your idea will be the one that we use, but the fact that you were able to voice it, for me, I have won the battle. And that's the kind of country that we wanted to create. And I'm so impressed to see it prevail with the Gen Zs, the young ones, who give me so much stress if I watch them or if I have talks with them, because my nephews and nieces are Gen Zs. And they are such radicalized human beings, sometimes unreasonable, but I think it's a correct environment and the foundation that we left for them to be who they are authentically so and be citizens of a society that contributes meaningfully so that everybody feels seen. And so you're right. I mean, pushing back all the time is something that I remember. Well, I was seen as a troublemaker of some sort. And I was very comfortable with that because I refused to conform to heteronormativity that did not identify with everybody else, even the heterosexual people that actually are in the working environment that I was in, because I was thinking about the broader picture of the content that we're going to produce and the message we're sending to 50 million South Africans at that point. And it had to be something that is acceptable to everybody, that doesn't offend one part of the society and then benefits the other part of society. We had to be in the middle, and being in the middle, ironically, was meaning that we can be objective with certain stories.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I wanted to know more about is when you were going through these experiences in your career, these challenges, because let's be honest, this is not easy for anyone. Like, life is hard, and then you add in all these other factors that you were bringing up. What kept you going, or what keeps you going? Because let's be honest, hard times don't stop no matter where you're at in your career. So what is keeping you going in your career for audiences the world wants to know?
I think love keeps me going. I know it might sound like a weird thing, but I think love kept me going. And I was married to a beautiful man for 8 years of my life, and that was at the height of my career as well. And he was my biggest cheerleader. And I realized after he passed on in a tragic accident in 2017 that the love he gave me fueled every passion that I had. And before that, the love from my family, kept on bringing me to new heights of everything that I wanted to achieve. And there is nothing that I can say I wasn't able to achieve. And I always like, invoking, Toni Morrison, that it's important to love. It's interesting, it's intellectually demanding, it's spiritually demanding. And it's important for you to do something that you respect between the time that you're born and between the time that you're going to die. And then what is central in all of this was love. When you love what you do, when you receive love and you give love, you are sure to get to where you are going. So for me, it was that.
Hello everyone, this is Justin Cobb, and that was Matuba Mahlatjie. He's fantastic. I'm gonna leave his profile link in the comments, that way you can check out him and his work, collaborate with him if you can or if you desire. He's great. I appreciate his story. I am moved by the work that he's done. It's incredible. Thank you, audiences, for tuning in to Insight. It means the world. Be sure to subscribe and help us build the following. Don't forget to like and comment and let us know what you think. Be sure to stay tuned for more insights. Check us out on our various platforms, including our Medium and Spotify, and stay in the know. There's plenty more coming. Until then.